Introduction.
The boy lay in the shallow grave behind the industrial fence, his schoolbooks still tied with string. Blood had soaked into the pages of his arithmetic notebook. The wind moved the tall grass over his face. Rostov detectives stood in a circle, cigarettes burning down to their fingers. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to be the one to say the word that would make it real, because once you say it, you can never unsay it. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo killed at least 52 people across the Soviet Union between 1978 and 1990. Most were children, some were young women, some were young men. He hunted in bus stations, wooded parks, and along the rail lines threading out of Rostov-on-Don like dark veins into the countryside. For more than a decade, the Soviet state denied a serial killer existed at all. Official reports classified the deaths as isolated incidents. Some files blamed foreign agents. A few were simply closed. When the truth finally surfaced, it forced Soviet and later Russian investigators to confront something that shattered a foundational myth: that the socialist state protected its people, that an ordinary-looking middle-aged man with a briefcase and a factory badge could move through crowds for 12 years, choosing victims no one would immediately miss. The files remain sealed long after his execution. Some witnesses still hesitate to speak. The question that lingers inside every dusty folder and every redacted report is a simple one. How many more cases like this were buried because the system preferred silence over answers? Every name in this archive was a real person. Every one of them deserved to be found sooner. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many other Rostov files were buried before anyone was allowed to read them. Nothing buried, nothing forgotten. Rostov-on-Don in the 1970s smelled of diesel fuel and river mud. It sat on the lower Don like a knuckle pressed into the Soviet map, a rail hub, a port city, ringed by collective farms and pine forests that swallowed light by mid-afternoon. Freight trains rattled through at all hours. Workers changed shifts under sodium lamps that cast long, jagged shadows between warehouses. Families packed into concrete apartment blocks where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors' arguments and your neighbors' silences equally well. It was a city of movement and anonymity. Nobody asked names at the platforms. Nobody lingered. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yablochnoye, a small Ukrainian village still raw from collectivization. He arrived into a world already broken. His father, Roman Chikatilo, was conscripted during the Second World War and spent years in German captivity, a fact that marked the family with quiet shame in a country that called its prisoners traitors. His mother, Anna, raised Andrei and his younger sister Tatiana through the famine years, largely alone. She spoke of a firstborn son, Stepan, who had died before the war. She told young Andrei the boy had been taken and eaten by neighbors during the Great Hunger of 1932. Whether that story was true, it lodged in the child's mind like a splinter. Whether that story was true, it lodged in the child's mind like a splinter. Neighbors remembered the Chikatilo family as withdrawn, not unfriendly, simply absent from the texture of village life. Andrei walked to school alone. He wore the same patched clothes through multiple winters. Teachers noted he read well and absorbed detail, but rarely volunteered an answer. When other children wrestled or chased one another across the yard, he stood at the edge, watching, always watching. His eyesight was poor. He would later be diagnosed with severe myopia, meaning the world beyond arm's reach existed as a blur of color and suggestion. Faces were shapes, people were outlines. He learned to study movement instead. By the time Chikatilo reached adulthood, the Soviet system had already delivered several important lessons. Certain people disappeared without explanation. The state controlled movement, speech, and official records. Missing persons reports were filed only when a family had the persistence and the political standing to push. In Rostov, factory workers and students passed one another on crowded platforms every morning without exchanging a word. Faces turned toward the middle distance. That silence became the first condition that allowed the killings to continue. Fact: Rostov-on-Don was one of the Soviet Union's most transient cities. Rail traffic logs from 1978 recorded over 40,000 individual passenger movements per week through the central station alone. In a crowd that size, a man with a briefcase was invisible by design. Not a monster, not yet, just a man in a coat, standing near the platform edge, watching the trains arrive. The signs were there, they always are. The tragedy of cases like this is never that the warning signs were hidden. The tragedy is that nobody had a system for reading them. School records from the 1940s document that Chikatilo suffered from chronic bedwetting well into his teenage years, a humiliation in shared village housing where privacy was nearly impossible. Classmates recalled him as an easy target, tall, ungainly, nearly blind without glasses he could not always afford to replace, moving through the schoolyard with the cautious, hunched posture of a child expecting a blow. He was bullied consistently. He did not fight back. He remembered everything. He later told investigators during post-arrest interviews that he spent hours walking alone in the forests near Yablochnaya, constructing elaborate fantasies in which he held absolute power over others. Not sexual fantasies initially, control fantasies. Scenarios in which the humiliation ran in the opposite direction. This cognitive pattern, fantasy as rehearsal, is well documented in the behavioral literature on sexually motivated homicide. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts often describe Chikatilo as a loner who showed obvious signs of danger throughout his life. The reality is more troubling. He was functional, employed, married, and raising children during the years he was killing. He taught school, attended Communist Party meetings, and traveled on legitimate factory business. FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who later reviewed the case for comparative research, noted, "The organized offender presents socially. He holds a job, he maintains relationships. The disorganization is internal, and it surfaces only at the moment of attack." Military service came in the mid-1950s. Chikatilo was assigned to a communications unit, clerical, unremarkable. He was rejected for active combat roles following an assessment that cited poor coordination. Accounts from fellow conscripts describe a man who kept to himself, who rarely drank with the group, and who reacted to mockery with a stillness that some found more unsettling than anger. He was discharged without incident. Marriage followed in 1963 to Faina Odnachiva, a woman introduced through his sister. His wife later stated in open court testimony that he was functionally impotent under normal circumstances, that sexual function occurred only during states of extreme emotional agitation. 2 children were born, Lyudmila in 1965 and Yuri in 1969. Neighbors described the household as quiet. Chikatilo himself was described as an unremarkable father, present but distant, the kind of man who occupied space in a room without filling it. He taught literature and Russian language at a school in Novoshakhtinsk through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Pause 0.8. In 1973, a parent filed a complaint with school administrators. She stated that Chikatilo had touched her daughter, Irina Karisheva, age 11, inappropriately during an after-school session. The complaint was handled entirely within the school. No police report was filed. The internal record, later retrieved by investigators, shows only a single line of acknowledgement and no disciplinary action beyond a quiet transfer to a different teaching post. The system had one chance to stop what was coming. It chose paperwork over action. Fact: Soviet educational institutions in the 1970s operated under strong institutional pressure to avoid scandals that might attract external scrutiny. Reporting a teacher to the militia risked drawing attention to the school's internal failures. The default response was containment, reassignment rather than removal, silence rather than investigation. Chikatilo was transferred. He continued teaching. The pattern of missed signals was already in motion, accumulating quietly, the way groundwater rises before a flood. December in Shakti feels like the inside of a cold furnace. The river carries ice fragments by mid-month. Mud freezes overnight into ridged concrete. The air tastes of coal smoke and iron, and the light, when it comes at all, arrives gray and reluctant and leaves early. On December 22nd, 1978, 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova left her family's apartment on Mikhanicheskaya Street to visit a school friend. She was wearing a red woolen coat. She carried a small canvas bag. Her mother, Vera Zakotnova, would later describe her as a careful child, the kind who always told you where she was going and who was already home before dark. Lena never came home. She was found 3 days later, pulled from the Grushevka River by a maintenance worker checking a drainage sluice. She was 9 years old. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed multiple times with a narrow-bladed instrument. Her red coat was recovered downstream, snagged in the ice at the river's bank. Local investigators from the Shakti militia arrived at the scene within hours. The lead detective on the case was Lieutenant Alexander Zanisovsky, a 15-year veteran who had worked primarily theft and fraud cases. He was competent, he was thorough, he had never worked a murder with this particular signature. The investigation moved quickly toward a local man, Alexander Kravchenko, 25 years old, a laborer with a prior conviction for a sexual assault on a minor. He was known to police. He fit the available profile. Under sustained interrogation, he provided a confession. It was enough. For Shakti's investigators, under pressure to close the case, it was more than enough. Kravchenko was convicted of Lena Zakotnova's murder in 1979. He was executed in 1983. He was innocent. Andrei Chikatilo had been in Shakti in December 1978. He had recently acquired a small shed near the Grushevka River, ostensibly for storing work materials, a space he had obtained through a connection at his factory. Subsequent investigation would confirm that Lena Zakotnova's death occurred in or near that shed. Chikatilo's blood type was tested in 1984 and again in 1990. The results would eventually contribute to his conviction. But in December 1978, no one drew the connection. His name did not appear in the Zakotnova file. He was a supply clerk with a briefcase and a factory pass, traveling legitimately between Shakti and Rostov on scheduled business. Nobody looked twice. Alexander Kravchenko's wrongful conviction for the murder of Lena Zakotnova is documented in the official post-conviction review conducted during the 1992 Chikatilo trial. His case represents the first of at least 2 wrongful convictions directly connected to the investigation's failures. Myth versus reality. The popular account holds that Chikatilo was a careful, methodical killer from the beginning who deliberately selected victims no one would miss. The forensic record suggests a more chaotic reality. His first confirmed killing was opportunistic, located uncomfortably close to his own registered address, and left physical evidence at the scene. What protected him was not cunning. What protected him was institutional momentum, the pressure to name a suspect, close a file, and move on. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the Rostov psychiatrist who would later construct the first psychological profile of the Rostov killer, described this dynamic plainly in his 1991 analysis. The perpetrator did not succeed because he was exceptional. He succeeded because the system was designed to find someone, not necessarily the right someone. Lena Zakotnova was 9 years old. She liked arithmetic. Her teacher had marked her notebooks with commendation stars that her mother kept in a box after her death. She had told her mother that morning she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. She was the first. She would not be the last. And the man who killed her went home that night, changed his shirt, and caught the morning train back to Rostov. Between 1979 and 1982, bodies began appearing with a rhythm that nobody in the Rostov militia was yet willing to call a rhythm. They turned up in the places cities prefer not to see: the tree lines behind freight depots, the shallow water at the edges of parks, the brush-filled gullies between rail embankments and construction lots. Each body was found by someone going about ordinary business: a track worker, a dog walker, a child taking a shortcut. Each discovery sent a ripple through the local militia office, generated paperwork, and then, gradually, went still. The victims included Larisa Tikhenko, 17, a student from Novocherkassk who had been seen at the Rostov Central bus station on September 3, 1981. She worked evenings at a textile cooperative to support her younger siblings. She was last seen accepting directions from a middle-aged man near the platform. Her body was found the following morning in a stand of birch trees 3 kilometers from the station. She had been strangled and mutilated. There was Lyuba Biryuk, 13, from the village of Donskoy Leshoz, who disappeared walking home from a shop in June 1982. She had been sent to buy bread and sugar. She had been told to hurry back before supper. Her body was found in the tree line off a forestry road 12 days after she vanished. Forensic examination confirmed the same narrow blade stabbing pattern first seen on Lena Zakotnova in 1978. The same pattern, 4 years apart, 2 different districts, 2 different investigating teams. No one had connected them. This was not negligence in the simple sense. Soviet investigative procedure in the 1970s and early 1980s operated without computerized records, without a centralized violent crime database, and without a formal protocol for cross-district case comparison. Each militia district maintained its own ledgers, its own filing systems, its own definitions of what constituted an open case versus a cold one. A body found in Shakhty was a Shakhty problem. A body found in Novocherkassk was a Novocherkassk problem. They were not the same problem, not officially. Fact: the Soviet Union had no formal category equivalent to serial homicide in its criminal code during this period. The concept was considered a Western pathology, a product of capitalism's alienating effect on individuals. Soviet criminological literature, through the mid-1980s, largely dismissed the possibility of sexually motivated serial killing as statistically negligible within a socialist society. Pause. 8S. Myth versus reality. Western accounts of the Chikatilo case frequently suggest that Soviet authorities deliberately suppressed the investigation for ideological reasons from the very beginning. The reality is more layered. In the early years, suppression was less a decision than a default, the natural result of a system that had not built the infrastructure to recognize what it was looking at. Deliberate suppression came later, once recognition became unavoidable. Chikatilo, meanwhile, continued moving. He had accepted a position as a supply clerk for a large industrial enterprise, a role that gave him a legitimate travel warrant and a reason to appear at any rail station or bus depot in the Rostov region at any time. His briefcase, his factory badge, and his slightly distracted manner were a perfect costume. He was not hiding. He was hiding in plain sight. He attended Communist Party meetings. He filed expense reports. He brought home small gifts for his children. And on certain days, in certain stations, he watched the platforms and waited. It was September 1984, and the Rostov Central Station smelled the way it always smelled in late summer. Engine grease, sunflower seeds, the sweet rot of overripe melon from the vendors outside the east entrance. The platforms were crowded. Passengers pushed against one another with the particular resigned force of Soviet commuters, bags held in front, faces forward. A plainclothes officer working a routine document check noticed a middle-aged man whose behavior didn't fit the flow of the crowd. He was lingering, moving, then stopping, watching a young woman near the kiosk. The officer approached. The man produced papers identifying him as Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, employee of the Novocherkassk Electric Locomotive Works, traveling on authorized factory business. The papers were in order, almost. There were inconsistencies. The travel date on his warrant didn't align precisely with the route he claimed. He was taken to the district station for processing. A routine search of his bag revealed a length of rope, a kitchen knife, and a jar of petroleum jelly. The items were documented. When a victim file was cross-checked, traces of blood found on his clothing were tested. The blood type came back as AB. Chikatilo's blood type on his official medical records was listed as A. The officer who processed him made a note. The discrepancy was logged, and then it was explained, wrongly, fatally, by the forensic science of the era. Tact. It is now understood that Chikatilo was one of an extremely rare subset of individuals whose blood type, as expressed in secretions, differs from their actual blood group. His serological secretions presented as type A, while his true blood type was AB. Soviet forensic capability in 1984 could not reliably account for this anomaly. The mismatch was recorded as evidence of innocence rather than evidence of an unusual physiological condition. He was held for 3 days. An alibi he provided for one date was checked and found to be false, but the alibi check was not linked back to the blood type discrepancy in time to affect the decision to release him. A colleague at his factory vouched for his general character. The knife and rope were recorded, but not sufficient without the blood match. Chikatilo was released. Detective Viktor Burakov, who would later lead the task force hunting the Rostov killer, reviewed the 1984 detention file years afterward. In his 1995 television interview, he described reading the processing notes and feeling a specific kind of sickness. Not anger, he said, but the particular nausea of understanding exactly how close the end had been and exactly how much it had cost that it didn't happen. He walked out of that station, and the killings continued for 6 more years. 6 more years, at least 22 more victims. The file was closed as a low-priority contact. The man with the briefcase caught a train home. Some accounts suggest Chikatilo was released due to political interference or deliberate cover-up at this stage. The documented record does not support this. The release was a forensic failure, compounded by procedural inadequacy, an almost unbearable series of legitimate mistakes, which, in its own way, is worse. They were not invisible. That is the first thing to understand. They had names. They had families who looked for them, who filed reports at local militia offices, who waited by telephones and looked out windows for weeks and sometimes years. They had neighbors who remembered their faces, and teachers who kept their old grade books, and mothers who, decades later, still set a place at the table without knowing why. The system made them invisible. The system's silence is what allowed Chikatilo to move through their lives like a shadow that no official record was designed to catch. 8S Masha Ryabenko, name partially reconstructed from trial records, was 16 when she disappeared from the Shakhty bus terminal in the spring of 1980. She had been working a seasonal agricultural posting on a collective farm outside Novocherkassk and was traveling home on a Friday afternoon with her wages in an envelope and a cotton headscarf tied under her chin. She was reported missing by her aunt 2 weeks after she failed to arrive. The militia report noted she was a seasonal worker and recommended the file be reviewed in 60 days. The 60-day review never occurred. The file was absorbed into a general unsolved ledger. Tanya Petrova, name reconstructed from regional court records, was 17, a first-year student at a vocational technical institute in Rostov, studying to become a seamstress. She had a photograph on her dormitory wall of the Black Sea coast, somewhere she had never been but planned to visit the following summer. She was last seen in October 1981 at the Rostov station's east platform, speaking with a man who offered to help her find the right connection for a train to Taganrog. A classmate watched her leave with him from a distance of approximately 20 meters. That classmate would not come forward until 1990, 9 years later, afraid of what it might mean to have seen something and said nothing. Pause. 8S Volodya Konenko, name reconstructed from trial records, was 12 years old, from a working-class district of Shakhty. He was a runaway, not the romanticized kind, but the kind produced by a household with a violent stepfather and insufficient food. He slept in rail stations because they were warm and nobody asked questions after midnight. He was small for his age. He had learned to be quiet and to accept help when it was offered, because accepting help was often the only option. He was found in a forested area near a freight siding in June 1983. He had been dead for several days. His age was estimated by the medical examiner. His name was not confirmed until a relative recognized a physical description published during the 1992 trial. He was 12 years old. He loved football. His mother had not known he was missing because she had not known he had run away. Of the 52 confirmed victims in the Chikatilo case, 14 were under the age of 13. 11 were runaways, seasonal laborers, or individuals documented as having no fixed address at the time of their disappearance. In 9 cases, missing persons reports were either never filed or were filed more than 2 weeks after the individual's last confirmed sighting. These delays were systemic, not accidental. Myth versus reality. A persistent narrative frames Chikatilo's victims as uniformly marginal, runaways, alcoholics, prostitutes, implying a kind of statistical logic to their targeting. The trial record contradicts this. His victims included university students, school children traveling on family errands, and young workers commuting on standard routes. What they shared was not marginality. What they shared was a moment of ordinary vulnerability, waiting for a connection, asking for directions, accepting an offer of assistance from a man with a briefcase and a factory badge who seemed, in every visible way, like a safe adult. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, in his psychological profile of the perpetrator prepared for investigators in 1985, identified this as a key behavioral signature. He does not select the weak, he selects the trusting. His method requires a brief period of apparent normalcy, a transaction that looks like help. The victim's cooperation is the mechanism. He manufactures consent through the appearance of authority. Ira Dunankova, name reconstructed from victim registry, published in Conradi, 1992, was 19, a university student studying geography at Rostov State. She had a particular interest in river systems. She had written a first-year paper on the hydrology of the Don Basin and received a commendation. She was traveling to visit a professor about a research project when she disappeared in October 1984. Her advisor waited 3 weeks before calling the dormitory. The dormitory waited another week before contacting her family. Her family, in a rural district south of Rostov, had no telephone. The notification arrived by post. By then, her file had already been assigned to the same ledger as Masha Ryabenko and the others. A shelf in a district office, a number without a face. She had wanted to map rivers. Instead, she became a number in a file that no one was supposed to read. 0.8 seconds. These are not statistics. They are not patterns. They are people who boarded trains and crossed platforms and trusted that the world around them was, on balance, safe. They trusted wrong, and the silence that followed their deaths was institutional, deliberate in its construction, if not always in its application, and it compounded every time a file was closed without resolution. Their names are spoken here because that is the least, the absolute least that can be done. By late 1984, Viktor Burakov had a map on his wall that no one else in the Rostov militia wanted to look at directly. Red pins for body locations, blue for last confirmed sightings, a dense cluster around the rail corridors radiating out of Rostov-on-Don, Shakhty, Novocherkassk, Taganrog, Gukovo. The pins traced a route rather than a territory. Whatever this was, it moved along the rail lines like freight. It used the network. Burakov was 41 years old, a senior detective with the Rostov Criminal Investigation Department, and he had been assigned to the case after his predecessor requested reassignment on grounds of psychological exhaustion. This was not a promising inheritance. 8S, he assembled what resources he could, which was not many. The task force in its early form was 5 men working from a shared office that had previously been used for storage, with access to a single telephone line, handwritten case ledgers, and whatever cooperation neighboring districts chose to provide, which was inconsistent and often guarded. Computer-assisted case linking did not exist in this context. Everything was done by hand. Every witness statement was typed on a mechanical typewriter and filed in a physical folder. Cross-referencing meant pulling stacks of folders and reading through them sequentially. Burakov did this for months. He slept in his office. His colleagues later recalled him as a man who had developed a particular kind of controlled obsession. Not frantic, but relentless, like a machine running at a steady, unbearable temperature. He also did something unprecedented for a Soviet investigator of his era. He sought out a psychiatrist. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky was a forensic psychiatrist at the Rostov Medical Institute, known for his work on deviant psychology and a system that still preferred to treat such work with ideological suspicion. Burakov contacted him informally, outside official channels, because the official channels would have required him to justify the consultation to superiors, who were still reluctant to formally acknowledge the existence of a serial killer in their jurisdiction. Bukhanovsky reviewed the available case material and, in 1985, produced a psychological profile, the first of its kind in Soviet criminal investigation. The profile described the perpetrator as a male, aged between 45 and 50, likely employed in a role requiring frequent travel, functioning socially but experiencing profound sexual dysfunction, and driven by a compulsion that had developed over decades before its first lethal expression. The profile estimated he had likely committed similar acts without detection before the killings began. The profile was accurate on nearly every count. Dr. Bukhanovsky's 1985 profile of the Rostov killer is considered one of the earliest documented examples of forensic psychological offender profiling in Soviet or post-Soviet criminal investigation. It predated the formal adoption of FBI-style profiling techniques in Russian law enforcement by more than a decade. Political pressure remained constant and came from multiple directions. Regional Communist Party officials did not want a serial killer narrative appearing in public discourse. It contradicted the fundamental claim that socialist society produced psychologically healthy citizens. The militia hierarchy wanted results, specifically arrests, not profiles and theories. Burakov operated in the space between those pressures. He requested additional staffing 4 times. He received it once, briefly, before the officers were reassigned. He kept the map on his wall. He kept adding pins. The task force is sometimes portrayed in Western accounts as a monolithic, heavily resourced investigation held back only by political interference. The reality was a small, chronically underfunded unit staffed by detectives who were also carrying conventional caseloads, working a case that their institution was simultaneously trying to solve and trying not to publicly acknowledge. The miracle is not that it took so long. The miracle is that Burakov kept going. His name was Yuri Kalinick. He was 20 years old, slightly built, with a mild cognitive impairment that made him an easy target for extended interrogation. He had no stable address. He had no strong advocate. In the Shakti militia's estimation in 1983, he had something more useful than evidence. He had proximity. He had been seen near a location relevant to one of the cases, and under sustained questioning, he gave investigators what they needed, a confession. It wasn't true. The evidence against him was circumstantial at every point, and his confession, reviewed by defense attorneys decades later, contains factual errors about basic details of the crimes, details that only the actual perpetrator would have known to avoid. Kalinick served time. He was not executed. But he was not exonerated during the period that mattered, and his case consumed investigative attention and institutional credibility that might otherwise have been directed toward the real perpetrator. The case that drew more lasting international attention was different. Andrei Slivko was a different killer entirely, a youth leader in Stavropol who was arrested in 1985 for the murders of 7 boys and executed in 1989. His case ran parallel to the Chikatilo investigation and created significant confusion in Soviet law enforcement resources and public awareness. Several deaths in the Rostov region were initially attributed to Slivko's activities based on superficial similarities in victim type. They were not his victims. 8S. The most devastating wrongful case connected directly to the Chikatilo investigation was that of Alexander Kravchenko, already executed in 1983 for the 1978 murder of Lena Zakotnova, the killing that was, in fact, Chikatilo's first confirmed crime. When this was established definitively during the 1990 investigation and confirmed at the 1992 trial, the Soviet, and then Russian, legal system was confronted with an irreversible fact. A man had been executed for a crime that a man who was alive and in custody had committed. The state had killed an innocent man to close a file. Kravchenko had been 23 years old when he was arrested. He was 27 when he was executed. He had spent those years insisting he was innocent. Fact: the wrongful execution of Alexander Kravchenko for the murder of Lena Zakotnova is confirmed in the official case review documents submitted during the 1992 Chikatilo trial and is documented in Cullen 1993 and Lori 1993. Russian authorities did not issue a formal posthumous exoneration until years later. Chikatilo knew Kravchenko had been convicted. He knew another man was carrying the weight of what he had done. This did not stop him. There is no evidence it troubled him. If anything, the investigative confusion that followed, the resources spent on wrong suspects, the institutional reluctance to reopen closed cases, gave him exactly what he needed: time. Myth versus reality. The narrative sometimes frames the wrongful convictions as evidence of deliberate state conspiracy to protect Chikatilo. The documented record suggests something more banal and more damning, a system optimized to close cases rather than to solve them, in which the pressure to produce a result was stronger than the pressure to produce the right result. No conspiracy was needed. The machinery was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Pause. 1.5 seconds. In 1987, something shifted. The killings, which had already been occurring with terrible consistency for nearly a decade, began to come faster. Where the gaps between confirmed attacks had previously run to months, they now narrowed to weeks. Where victims had been primarily teenage girls and young women, the profile broadened. Boys began to appear in the files, young men in their early 20s. The targeting logic, always fluid, became more indiscriminate, a function of urgency rather than selection. Viktor Burakov recognized the acceleration. He had been tracking the gaps, charting them by calendar against the body recovery dates, watching for patterns and frequency. He saw the compression. He reported it up the chain. What he received in response was a directive to reduce public discussion of the investigation. What he received in response? 1987 was a particular kind of form in Soviet life. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost was beginning to open certain official silences, but not this one. The Rostov killer case, known within law enforcement as the Forest Strip murders, or simply the Lesopolosa files, remained categorized at a level that prevented any media acknowledgement. Parents in Rostov did not know, officially, that a predator was operating in their rail stations and parks. The warning that might have saved lives was locked inside a restricted classification. Children continued to use the rail system alone. Young women continued to accept directions from strangers on crowded platforms. The stranger with the briefcase continued to travel. The stranger with the briefcase continued to travel. 8S, Sergei Markov, name reconstructed from trial testimony, was 15 in the summer of 1987, a quiet, serious boy from Shakhty who collected rail timetables as a hobby. He could recite departure and arrival times for most major stations in the Rostov region from memory. He had traveled alone by train before. He knew the system. He was not naive about crowds or strangers. He was found in a tree break near the Don-Leskhaz freight line 3 weeks after he was last seen at the Shakhty platform. He had been dead for more than 2 weeks when he was found. His timetable notebook was not recovered. Katya Voronova, name reconstructed from trial records, was 22, a nurse's aide at a district hospital in Novocherkassk, studying part-time for a full nursing certification. She worked nights. She traveled by train to evening classes twice a week. Her colleagues knew her schedule. They expected her on a Tuesday in October 1988. She did not arrive. Her colleagues assumed she had missed the train. Her supervisor made a note in the attendance log and moved on. Her body was found 6 days later in the birch stands off the Novocherkassk rail approach. The forensic signature was identical to every file Burakov had been reading for 3 years. By 1988, Burakov's team had identified 11 distinct physical markers linking the open cases. 11 markers, and they still did not have a name. Chikatilo's employment record during this period shows regular, documented factory business trips throughout the region. His expense claims were approved without exception. His supervisor, Gennady Morozov, later told investigators that Chikatilo was regarded as conscientious, if somewhat cold, the kind of employee who completed his assignments without requiring supervision, who never caused problems, who simply appeared and disappeared according to his travel schedule. His absences were regular. They matched the dates on Burakov's calendar. Nobody had thought to look at the expense claims. A fact of a safe Sasaks expendum carrying in factory, technology and Infowenienretraj, conducted in 1991 and summarized in the Rostov Regional Court proceedings, confirmed that every single confirmed murder could be placed within a 24 to 48-hour window of a documented factory trip. His employer's records were, in retrospect, a near-perfect timeline of his crimes. The records existed throughout the investigation. No one requested them until 1990. Myth versus reality. It is sometimes suggested that Chikatilo possessed extraordinary cunning that made him impossible to catch through normal investigative means. The travel record evidence contradicts this entirely. His pattern was consistent, documented, and retrievable. What was absent was not the evidence. The evidence was there, filed in a factory administrator's cabinet in Novocherkassk. What was absent was the investigative framework to ask for it. By late 1988, Burakov's map held 51 pins. The cluster had thickened around Rostov Central Station and the 2 main freight approach corridors. The profile Bukhanovsky had written in 1985 had held up through every new case. Male, traveling, middle-aged, functionally invisible in public spaces. Burakov requested access to factory and enterprise travel records for the region. The request required interdepartmental authorization. The authorization required 3 levels of bureaucratic review. It moved slowly through the system. The man it was designed to find moved faster. In the winter of 1988, an 11-year-old boy named Pavel Kusmin, name reconstructed from victim registry, was approached at the Gukovo bus station by a man who offered to help him find a bus to his grandmother's village. Pavel had been on this route before, alone. He was confident. He accepted the man's assistance. Pavel's grandmother waited 4 days before traveling to his parents' home to ask where he was. The chain of notifications that followed took 11 days to reach the militia desk that held Burakov's open file. By then, There was nothing left to do for Pavel Kuzmin except add a pin to the map. The acceleration continued into 1989, 8 confirmed victims in 14 months, the fastest period of the entire 12-year span. Burakov stopped sleeping at his desk. He moved a cot into his office. He redrew the map from scratch, cross-referencing every travel date, every station sighting, every physical description from every witness statement filed since 1978. He was looking for a shape in the data, the outline of a single person moving through all of it. The shape was there. He could almost see it. He just didn't have a name to put inside it yet. The operation was called, in internal memos, Platform Control. Beginning in 1987 and running intermittently through 1990, plainclothes officers from the Rostov Criminal Investigation Department were deployed to train stations and bus terminals across the region, assigned to watch for behavior matching the composite description developed from Bukhanovsky's profile and Burakov's witness review. Middle-aged male, traveling alone, approaching potential victims under the pretense of providing information or assistance, likely carrying a bag or briefcase, may present documentation suggesting legitimate employment. The description matched approximately 40% of the men in any given station at any given time. Platform Control ran on inadequate resources from its first day. Full coverage of the 11 primary stations identified as high risk would have required a continuous deployment of 42 officers in rotating shifts. The actual staffing level peaked at 9. Budget requests were processed on a quarterly cycle. By the time additional funding was approved, the operational calendar had already shifted. Chikatilo, for his part, appeared to make adjustments without being told to. His frequency at Rostov Central Station decreased after 1987. His pattern moved outward to smaller stations, Gukovo, Krasny Sulin, Zverevo, where surveillance coverage was thinnest. Whether this was conscious adaptation or simply the natural expansion of his operational range remains debated in the investigative literature. One surveillance log entry from August 1988, later identified by Burakov's team during the post-arrest review, records a plainclothes officer observing a middle-aged man matching the composite description at Novocherkassk station. The officer noted the man was wearing a gray jacket and carrying a leather briefcase, appeared to be watching a group of teenagers near the platform entrance, and then departed on a northbound train. The officer logged the sighting as routine passenger behavior, no actionable indicators. The date of the sighting falls within the established window for a confirmed killing in that area. The officer was never identified or censured. He had done what the operational guidelines instructed him to do. The guidelines were simply not equipped to catch what they were looking for. The surveillance apparatus saw him. It looked directly at him, and it did not know what it was seeing. There were other failures of a different kind. Informants operating within Rostov's transient community, the seasonal workers, the runaways, the unofficial economy of station platforms, provided several descriptions between 1986 and 1989 of a man who approached young people with offers of assistance. The descriptions were consistent. In at least 3 cases, informants provided physical descriptions that matched Chikatilo's known appearance. These reports were filed. They were not cross-referenced against the Lesopolosa files because the Lesopolosa files were held at a different administrative level than the informant reports. The 2 filing systems did not communicate. Myth versus reality. Retrospective accounts of the surveillance failures often focus on the specific missed sightings as the critical errors. The deeper failure was structural. The information existed, witnesses had provided it, officers had logged it. The failure was in the architecture that kept the right information from reaching the right desk. No single officer's error caused it. The entire system caused it. Viktor Burakov, in his 1991 ministry report, described the surveillance period with characteristic bluntness. We were watching the stations. He was watching us watch them. He made adjustments and we did not. We were not faster. We were not smarter. We were not resourced to be either. The system that was supposed to catch him was the same system that kept teaching him how to stay free. It came not from a dramatic forensic discovery or a surveillance victory. It came from paperwork. In late 1990, a young analyst assigned to Burakov's team began a systematic cross-reference of station log entries, the handwritten registers maintained by platform staff at smaller stations, recording passengers who purchased tickets for cash or presented unusual documentation. It was archival work, painstaking. the kind of task assigned to junior personnel because it required more patience than skill. The analyst's name was Galina Tiomkina, name reconstructed from task force records. She was 26 years old. She had been working the Lesopolosa file for 4 months. She found a pattern in the Don Leskos station logs. Pause 08S. On 3 separate dates, when confirmed victims had last been seen in the Don Leskos corridor, the same notation appeared in the station register. A passenger had presented a factory travel warrant from the Novocherkassk Electric Locomotive Works. The handwriting of the station officer who made the notation varied. Different shifts, different staff, but the warrant origin was the same. Burakov's team pulled the Novocherkassk Electric Locomotive Works employee travel records. The cross-reference took 11 days to complete by hand. On the 12th day, one name appeared against every relevant date: Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. The name was already in the system. His 1984 detention record was still on file. The document check, the blood type anomaly, the release. Burakov retrieved it and read it in one sitting. Then he read it again. He contacted Dr. Bukhanovsky. Bukhanovsky reviewed the file and the new travel record evidence and confirmed the behavioral signature, the travel pattern, the profile of a middle-aged, functionally employed male with a legitimate reason to be at every relevant location on every relevant date. It matched. Every axis of the 1985 profile matched. Burakov placed Chikatilo under discreet surveillance. Fact: the decision to move to surveillance rather than immediate arrest was strategic. Burakov and the prosecution team needed to build an evidentiary case that could survive trial. Given the 1984 blood type anomaly on file, a premature arrest without additional forensic corroboration risked a defense challenge that might not hold. The surveillance period lasted approximately 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, no further victims were confirmed. Whether Chikatilo suspected observation is not established in the record. He continued his factory routine. He traveled. He filed expense reports. On November 6, 1990, he was observed at the Don Leskos station, approaching a young woman. Officers moved in before any contact beyond a brief conversation occurred. He was arrested without resistance. He was carrying a briefcase. Inside the briefcase were a length of rope, a folding knife, and a hand towel. He gave his name and occupation without being asked. He asked, calmly, what this was about. Myth versus reality. The arrest is sometimes described as a high-tension confrontation. The documented record describes the opposite. Chikatilo did not run. He did not resist. He presented his factory papers, as he had done dozens of times before, and waited. The man who had evaded detection for 12 years was apprehended in the same manner as any routine document stop, quietly, bureaucratically, in a station that smelled of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke, just like every other station he had ever used as a hunting ground. There was no drama at the end. There was just a middle-aged man with a briefcase, standing at a platform, waiting to see if it would work one more time. It didn't. It didn't. The interrogation of Andrei Chikatilo lasted 9 days before he began to talk. The early sessions were stone. He denied everything, calmly and completely, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been constructing his ordinary life cover for 12 years. He asked for water. He asked for his meals on time. He sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at the wall behind the interrogator's head and said nothing of use. Viktor Burakov's team tried standard approaches. They laid photographs on the table. They read names aloud. Chikatilo looked at the photographs. He heard the names. He said nothing. On the 9th day, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky entered the interrogation room. Bukhanovsky did not treat Chikatilo as a criminal to be broken. He treated him as a patient to be understood, a careful, deliberate choice that Burakov had authorized over the objections of several colleagues who felt the approach was too accommodating. Bukhanovsky began reading aloud from the psychological profile he had written in 1985. The detailed portrait of a man formed by specific childhood experiences, specific psychological pressures, specific developmental failures. Chikatilo listened, and then, quietly, he began to correct the details that were wrong. He talked for 40 hours over the following days. He described 56 murders. The investigators had confirmed records for 52. 4 remained officially unverified. He described each killing with a specificity that left no investigative doubt, Locations, sequences, details that had never been published, details that only the person present could have known. He described the victims. He described the pretexts he had used to draw them away from crowded areas. He described the geography of remote sidings and forest tracks with the casual precision of a man recounting a regular commute. He expressed no remorse. He explained, in a flat, instructional tone, that remorse was not the appropriate framework for understanding what had happened. He described his compulsions as external forces rather than internal choices, a framing that Bukhanovsky documented carefully and that would become central to the trial's psychiatric deliberations. Pause 0.8. Fact: Chikatilo's confession included accurate directions to several body sites that had never been located. 3 previously unknown remains were recovered using his directions. This is documented in the Rostov Regional Court records of 1992 and corroborated in Cullen 1993 and Lurie 1993. He also described, unprompted, his awareness that Alexander Kravchenko had been executed for the murder of Lena Zakotnova in 1983. He stated this without apparent emotion. When asked directly whether he had thought about Kravchenko's execution while continuing to kill, he paused for several seconds. Then he said, "I thought about many things." 0.8 seconds. The investigators worked through the nights. Locations were dispatched to forensic teams as Chikatilo provided them. The matches came back consistent. The physical evidence from each site aligned with the confession details. The chain was complete. Myth versus reality. Chikatilo is sometimes portrayed in popular culture as a calculated manipulator who used the confession as performance or self-aggrandizement. The interrogation transcripts, reviewed by multiple forensic psychologists, suggest a more complex picture. A man who had maintained a double life for 12 years and who, once the mechanism of concealment was removed, found the act of disclosure easier than anyone anticipated. Bukhanovsky's assessment was that the confession was not performance, it was release. He had been carrying the weight of what he was for 54 years. When someone finally asked him to put it down, he put it down. That is not absolution, it is simply what the record shows. The trial opened in Rostov on April 14, 1992. Chikatilo arrived in a metal cage, a specially constructed courtroom enclosure installed to manage security and the court administrators acknowledged privately to manage the crowd. The families of victims packed the public gallery. Some had traveled from rural districts they had never left before. Some held photographs of their children. Some simply sat with their hands in their laps and their eyes fixed on the cage. The defendant paced inside it. He muttered, occasionally shouted, interrupted testimony with non sequiturs, and at several points claimed he was lactating or suffering from radiation poisoning. His attorneys argued that his behavior demonstrated genuine psychiatric incapacity. 3 independent psychiatric evaluations had reached different conclusions, a finding that itself became part of the trial record. The proceedings lasted 14 months, covering 52 counts of murder and multiple counts of sexual assault. Testimony from surviving witnesses, forensic experts, and investigating officers was heard in both open and sealed sessions. The sealed segments were restricted primarily to protect families from the most graphic forensic detail, a courtesy that the Soviet system had not extended to the investigation, but that the post-Soviet court granted to the living. Dr. Bukhanovsky testified at length. He described Chikatilo as suffering from a severe and chronic sexual sadism disorder, functional in social presentation, driven by a compulsion that had developed over decades and that had never been subject to any clinical intervention or detection. He did not argue that this constituted legal incapacity. He argued that it constituted a case study in what happens when a society has no system for identifying the condition before its lethal expression. The court was not only trying one man, it was trying the system that had allowed him to operate for 12 years. The verdict came on October 15, 1992, one day before Chikatilo's 56th birthday. Guilty on 52 counts of murder, guilty on multiple counts of sexual assault. The remaining 4 killings he had described in his confession could not be confirmed to the court's legal standard and were not included in the verdict. The sentence was death. Appeals were filed, citing psychiatric grounds. They moved through the system with the slow, bureaucratic inevitability of every document in every file that had ever been associated with this case. The Russian Constitutional Court reviewed and dismissed the central appeal in early 1994. Fact: the execution of Andrei Chikatilo was carried out on February 14, 1994, at Novocherkassk prison, the same city where he had worked, where he had filed his expense reports, where he had lived an unremarkable domestic life while conducting what the prosecution described as a 12-year predatory campaign. He was killed by a single gunshot behind the right ear, the standard method of Soviet and Russian judicial execution. He was 57 years old. Viktor Burakov learned of the execution through a colleague who called him at home. He was not present at the prison. He did not request to be. He went back to his office that morning and began reviewing a different file. A persistent myth holds that Chikatilo showed defiant or theatrical behavior at the moment of execution. Speeches, pronouncements, theatrical gestures. Russian Ministry of Justice records describe a quiet and unremarkable final hour. He ate his meal. He did not speak at length. He was led to the execution room without resistance. The man who had moved through crowds undetected for 12 years met his end the way he had always moved through the world, quietly, without drawing attention, leaving behind only the record of what he had done. In the end, the most ordinary thing about him was how he died. Conclusion: the Chikatilo investigation did not end with the execution. It left a structural reckoning, one that Soviet institutions had avoided for 12 years, and that the new Russian state was now obligated to confront. The wrongful convictions, the released suspect, the closed files, the institutional preference for silence over accuracy, these were not aberrations. They were features of a system optimized for different objectives than justice. Missing persons protocols were revised in the early 1990s to require faster escalation of reports involving minors. Inter-district information sharing, long resisted on grounds of administrative sovereignty, was formally mandated for violent crime cases. Forensic laboratory capacity was identified as a priority for external funding. Dr. Bukhanovsky's work contributed directly to the eventual establishment of forensic psychiatric consultation as a standard element of serious crime investigation in Russia. Many of the early files remain inaccessible. The cases of Yuri Kalenik and Alexander Kravchenko received different degrees of posthumous acknowledgement. The families of victims who were never formally identified have not, in most documented cases, received official notification. Some victims confirmed at trial were never publicly named because their families requested privacy that the post-Soviet state, unlike its predecessor, chose to honor. The body count of 52 is the confirmed legal number. Investigators who worked the case believe the actual total is higher. The files that might resolve the question are held in archives that have not been opened. 52 names are confirmed. The rest remain the property of a system that still has not decided whether to speak. The question that the Chikatilo case leaves is not primarily about one man's psychology. It is about what a system must be built to do before violence becomes visible, and what it costs in human lives and human names when the answer is nothing. Lena Zakotnova was 9 years old. She had a red coat and a canvas bag and a plan to visit a friend. She never arrived. She's the first name on this file. She should have been the last. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many other files like this one are still waiting to be opened. Every name in this archive was a real person. Nothing buried, nothing forgotten. Sources and references. Sources and references. Seconds Permine, Peter, The Red Ripper, Inside the Mind of Russia's Most Brutal Serial Killer, London, Virgin Books, 1992. 2. Cullen, Robert, The Killer Department, New York, Pantheon, 1993. 3. Krivich, Mikhail, and Olgert Olgin, Comrade Chikatilo, The Psychopathology of a Serial Killer, Fort Lee, New Jersey, Barricade Books, 1993. 4. Lurie, Richard, Hunting the Devil, The Search for the Russian Ripper, New York, HarperCollins, 1993. 5. Burakov, Viktor, The Rostov Maniac Investigation, Internal Ministry of Internal Affairs Report, 1991, declassified excerpts. 6. Chikatilo convicted of 52 murders, The New York Times, October 16, 1992. 7. Russian serial killer executed, Izvestia, February 16, 1994, English translation, Archive Holdings. 8. Court transcript summary, Rostov Regional Court, 1992, published in Russian Legal Compilations. 9. Forensic Failures in the Chikatilo Case, Journal of Soviet Criminology, Volume 12, 1995. 10. Missing Persons Protocols in the USSR, 1970-1990. Soviet Archives Bulletin, Number 4, 1993. 11. Rostov Serial Murders, A Timeline. Moscow News, November 1990. 12. Viktor Burakov Interview on the Chikatilo Manhunt, Russian Television Documentary, 1995. Transcript held in Rostov Regional Archive. 13. Post-Soviet Reforms in Homicide Investigation, European Journal of Criminology, Volume 3, 2006. 14. Official Execution Record, Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation, February 1994. 15. Wrestler, Robert K. and Tom Shackman, Whoever Fights Monsters, New York, St. Martin's Press, 1992. Comparative Serial Homicide Profiling, referenced for behavioral analysis context. 16. Bukhanovsky, Alexander O. Psychological Profile of the Rostov Region Perpetrator, Role of Election. 17. Trimerator, Tembal Nigo, University of Rostoville, 26 Moderna. 17. Resolution, Berlier, 25. The Rostov Medical Institute Internal Report, 1985, summarized in Cullen, 1993, and Lurie, 1993. 17. Wrongful Convictions in the Chikatilo Investigation, The Cases of Kravchenko and Kalanick, Russian Legal Review, Volume 7, 1994. 18. Holden, Richard N., Organized and Disorganized Crime, Offender Typology in Sexually Motivated Homicide, Journal of Police Science and Administration, Volume 15, Number 3, 1987. Behavioral Classification Framework Applied to Soviet Case Analysis.